¿Quién necesita traducción? Is there anyone here who needs translation? We have a translator. Say it again, Erica, but a better Spanish.
¿Hay alguien presente que necesita traducción?
If you like what you hear today, Don wanted me to announce that he's going to air this on a future program that he's running on KFAI on Thursdays at 1 p.m. And also Carla is going to post it on the Facebook page for the Twin Cities Cuba Committee. And also we're recording it for the Anti-War Committee. And we'll be posting it there too. So if you like what you hear and you've got a friend who isn't here, you should feel free to share it with them so they can get the benefits of it too.
Welcome to our event tonight with Steve Ellner. The Anti-War Committee is excited to be a part of this national speaking tour as a part of our work to resist regime change. This tour is building national resistance to Trump's threat to invade Venezuela and to U.S. sanctions. Sorry, I just found out that I was being too quiet. Just like in Iran, the U.S. is using sanctions and the threat of troops to try to decide who is the rightful leader of Venezuela. We know from countless examples, including Iraq, that the U.S. has no legitimacy to decide who another country's president should be. We believe in self-determination and that the people of another country, not U.S. imperialism, should get to decide who is in charge and how to use their own resources. My name is Jenny, and I'll be the co-MC tonight with Meredith.
Thank you again for coming tonight. We wanted, as the Anti-War Committee, to have this event tonight also as a part of our campaign against Trump's racist Muslim ban. Trump used the addition of Venezuela and North Korea as window dressing to try to pretend that his ban wasn't just targeting Muslims. And while Islamophobia was a part of his ban, U.S. imperialism was the thread that connected all of the countries together. Today's event will help the local anti-war movement see the connections between different countries on the list, particularly the relationship between U.S. imperialism and how it threatens Iran, and U.S. imperialism and how it threatens Venezuela. Additionally, we wanted to host this event today as a part of our 20 years of solidarity with the people of Colombia. We have sent numerous members of our committee, including Thistle, and Jenny, and Erica, and myself, to Colombia to witness U.S. intervention firsthand. And on each one of these trips, we heard from movement leaders in Colombia that they saw the revolution next door in Venezuela as deeply connected to their own struggle for freedom. This year, we've had our eyes on Colombia as the people in that country struggle for peace and to keep the peace. But meanwhile, the U.S. has actually been destabilizing the situation by doing things like organizing troop training efforts through NATO and other countries on the border with Venezuela, directly trying to threaten the Venezuelan government. The futures of these two countries are intertwined, and we are excited tonight to be able to have an opportunity to deepen our knowledge as well as your knowledge about the situation in Venezuela.
Our speaker tonight is Steve Ellner. He earned his PhD in Latin American history at the University of New Mexico in 1980. Since 1977, he has taught economic history and political science at the Universidad de Oriente in Puerto La Cruz, Venezuela, and for a 10-year period taught in the Graduate School of Law and Political Science of the Universidad Central de Venezuela. He has published many books on Venezuela, including Venezuela's Movimiento al Socialismo. Sorry about my Spanish. From guerrilla defeat to electoral politics. He has also been published on the op-ed page of the New York Times and the LA Times, as well as in The Nation and The Progressive, and has been a regular contributor to NACLA Report on the Americas, Commonwealth, and In These Times. Steve is going to give a presentation for around 40 minutes. Then we will do a Q&A. If we have time, we can do a discussion at the end. But please save your questions until the end of his talk. When we do the Q&A, we will try and hear from as many of you as possible, and we'll prioritize actual questions. So please be thoughtful while listening to Steve. Please welcome Steve Ellner.
Thank you, Jenny and Meredith. You know, when you give a talk, the first thing really that one has to do is to have some idea of where people are coming from, and base the talk on more or less the level of people's understanding and consciousness with regard to the subject matter. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the immediate effects of the sanctions, because I don't think that's necessary. But I think it's important to talk about the effects of the sanctions that are not being discussed, that people really don't know about, and even the Maduro government is not really pointing out in that much detail. But we do know that these sanctions have had a major impact on the Venezuelan economy. The decision by President Obama to label Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security, that a lot of people thought was just talk, because it was actually kind of comical that somebody would think that the country of the size of Venezuela could possibly threaten U.S. national security on any front, be it military, political, or cultural, or what have you. But the fact of the matter is that at the time, or shortly after, that executive order was issued in 2015, U.S. companies started pulling out of Venezuela. They hadn't invested in a big way in Venezuela following Chavez's election in 1998, but there were plants of companies like Ford, Kimberly-Clark, companies that had factories in Venezuela going way back in time. And those companies shut down their operations and left Venezuela. Following the sanctions that the Trump administration implemented, the same thing happened with other companies, such as Kellogg's and General Motors. So that this has had an important impact on the Venezuelan economy. The sanctions state that U.S. financial institutions cannot purchase bonds from the Venezuelan government or from the state oil company PDVSA. That has affected Venezuela in a big way, because the Venezuelan economy is not in a good situation, partly because of the price of oil having declined so sharply beginning in 2014. And any country facing a difficult economic situation attempts to refinance their public debt. So that is not unusual. Venezuela now can practically not do that, because U.S. financial institutions are prohibited from purchasing bonds from the Venezuelan government. Now, there are other banks around, banks in Europe, for instance. But we know from the situation in Iraq, and the situation in Iran, I'm sorry, with the sanctions that were just implemented just a few days ago, that European financial institutions and European companies follow the lead. For instance, Shell and Total, which is a French oil company, I think they're a major oil company, announced that they would comply with the sanctions that Trump issued and would not purchase oil from Iran. Now that seems kind of contradictory, because the European Union, and specifically France and Great Britain, the two countries, those two oil companies are from those two countries, they're opposed to the sanctions. They still have a treaty, the treaty that Obama promoted during the Obama administration, and yet those two companies have stated, we are afraid of retaliation, so we will comply with those sanctions. And the financial institution SWIFT said the same thing. You can Google this, it's on the internet, that SWIFT stated that in order to maintain the stability of the world financial system, we have decided not to have any transactions with banks in Iran. So whatever the United States decides has ramifications throughout the world. It's not just confined to the United States and U.S. companies and U.S. financial institutions. And the same thing has happened in the case of Venezuela. But up until now has not been publicized. And so people really don't have a feel for how the Venezuelan economy has been affected in so many different ways by these sanctions and by the narrative that comes out of Washington in terms of Venezuela representing a threat to U.S. national security. The Trump administration has played an activist role in attempting to isolate Venezuela on the world stage and specifically in Latin America. So we can say that, in a sense, Obama kind of like set the stage for this strategy on the part of the Trump administration of isolating Venezuela. But certainly Obama didn't go as far in terms of playing an activist role and attempting to, at least publicly, isolate Venezuela. But in the case of Trump, the Trump administration, leading members of the Trump administration have traveled throughout the region in order to gain support for this campaign against Venezuela. Tillerson, former Secretary of State, when he was Secretary of State, kicked off his Latin American tour in Austin. And he stated that sometimes, it was kind of a condescending statement. He said sometimes in Latin America it's necessary for the military to step in. You know, people don't have their act together, they don't really know what democracy is all about, and so sometimes the military has to step in. It sounded very similar to Nelson Rockefeller's famous trip, I think it was in 1970, when he returned and issued a famous report to the Nixon administration, saying basically the same thing. And we all know that in the 1970s in Latin America, you had, one military coup after another. Latin America, with just a few exceptions, was headed by military governments. So that following Tillerson's statement, Trump met first with his cabinet and then some Latin American leaders, even though members of his cabinet were opposed to, at least publicly, stating that the military option was on the table. More recently, Nikki Haley went to Colombia, and at the inauguration of Iván Duque, the recently elected president of Colombia, she stated publicly, we expect Colombia to play a lead role in the campaign to isolate Venezuela. And James Mattis did the same thing. He kicked off his Latin American tour in Brazil, and he said the same thing regarding the Brazilian government. But I think that that discourse, that narrative, that Venezuela that Venezuela is a dictatorship, that it's necessary to bring about regime change in Venezuela, I think that that has a big effect on Latin America in terms of furthering, intensifying the polarization that already exists. And the polarization that already exists in Venezuela and has really existed from the time that Chavez was first elected president. But it just intensifies that polarization. In the case of Latin America, we know that even though the Latin American rightist and centrist governments have been very hostile to the Maduro administration and have supported the application of the Democratic Charter, which would basically expel Venezuela from the OAS. In spite of that, the Latin American members of the Lima Group, which takes in the countries of the hemisphere which are trying to solve the Venezuelan problem, quote unquote. That's basically what their objective is. They stated that they were not in agreement with the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, who, I don't know if people have been following that, but Luis Almagro, I mean, everything he says sounds like it's coming from the radical fringe of the Venezuelan opposition. The Venezuelan opposition as a whole isn't even as radical as he is in opposition to the Venezuelan government. So he stated, or seconded Trump's statement that the military option is on the table. He said that, you know, a military option should be considered. And the Latin American countries, you know, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, these right-wing countries, stated that they were not in agreement with that. Now, they stated that not because of any consciousness with regard to the immorality of military intervention or any fear that military intervention, you know, could result in chaos and civil war, but rather, you know, the fear that that would trigger massive protests. I really doubt that Latin Americans as a whole would support that, and I think that that would mobilize people to, you know, be on the street and in a very active and ongoing way to oppose the intervention. So that was their position. But now Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil, and he stated during the campaign, even though he's kind of modified his discourse since then, he stated during the campaign that, that Brazil would consider, or he implied that Brazil would consider military intervention in Venezuela. So he's toned down his discourse. It kind of reminds me of Hitler, who, when he came to power, a lot of people said, you know, Hitler, now that he's in power, he's going to be a good boy. We can rest assured that he will not do what he said he would do in Mein Kampf. We all know what the scenario was there. So Bolsonaro is a very, very dangerous figure in Brazil. And what I said about the polarization, it seems to me that the other Latin American countries could easily go one way or the other with a regime change in Brazil, with the election of Duque in Colombia. I think that situation can change. That situation in which Latin America has stated publicly that it is opposed to military intervention. Those countries are so hostile to Venezuela that the narrative coming out of Washington, plus the election of Duque, who belongs to Uribe's party, which is tied to the paramilitary forces that have fought the guerrillas in Colombia, plus Duque with solid backing from military officers in an open kind of way. In fact, they indicated that they would not accept the election of Haddad, that if Bolsonaro was elected, that they would not allow that to happen. In other words, that they were threatening a military coup if their man wasn't elected president. So I think that the combination of those three things really spells trouble in terms of the stability in the region. I said before that Trump's discourse polarizes. And I said that it polarizes Latin America, and it also polarizes Venezuela. Because even though the radical fringe in Venezuela is dominant in terms of the opposition, the moderates, what I would call the moderates, are intimidated. There's no question about that. And they're intimidated partly because of Trump. And so the discourse that comes out of the opposition is a radical discourse. Radical in the bad sense of the word. Somebody always gets me in the use of that term, radical. Radical in the bad sense, the hardline opposition. But the fact of the matter is that the opposition is not united in Venezuela. The fact of the matter is that in the elections of May of this year, that Maduro won, most of the opposition was opposed to participation, did not participate, called for abstention, but an important leader, Henry Falcón, was a candidate and was supported, was endorsed by one of the two main traditional parties in Venezuela going back to the 1940s, COPEI, the Christian Democratic Party, centrist party, coming from the right. And another moderate centrist party coming from the left, the Movimiento al Socialismo, MAS, also participated, supported Falcón in those elections. The Trump government put pressure on Falcón to drop out of the race. The Trump administration threatened Falcón with placing Falcón on the list of those Venezuelans who are sanctioned by the US government. That is a list that says that their accounts will be frozen in the United States, and that they will not be given a visa to travel to the United States. And so Falcón was threatened by that. Now this, of course, wasn't public. And you may ask, on what basis am I saying that? Mark Weisbrot, who some of you may have heard of, he heads a think tank. He's an economist. He heads a think tank that deals mainly with economic issues in Washington, and is quite prolific. Published that in an article in The Guardian. And I asked Weisbrot, who I know, where he got that information from. And he said that he got it from Francisco Rodriguez. Francisco Rodriguez was Falcón's right-hand man. In other words, the guy that was running for president against Maduro, his right-hand man, his main economist, his main economic advisor, who has a lot of contacts in the United States. He used to work for, he's a banker, he used to work for, I mean, he's Venezuelan, son of a well-known Venezuelan political figure, but living in the United States with a lot of contacts. He worked for the Bank of America. Now he's with Torino Capital. He writes for foreign affairs, foreign policy, I'm sorry. And he told Weisbrot that the Trump administration threatened the main candidate of the opposition, that if he didn't drop out of the race, he would be placed on the list of people who are sanctioned. And even though it didn't work, because Falcón did continue his candidacy in the elections, he has since then changed his narrative. So that when the assassination attempt of Maduro took place a couple months ago, Falcón stated publicly that Maduro was responsible because Maduro has created a situation in Venezuela where a lot of people want to kill him. So he's changed his narrative. And, you know, quite possibly, I would say, most likely, the pressure from the Trump administration and the polarization effect that that pressure has on Venezuelan politics explains the change of Falcón's position. Falcón, previous to that, was fairly bold in saying, we got to participate in elections. He was defeated previously in elections for governor, and he came out and criticized the rest of the Venezuelan opposition, saying, I lost these elections. They were elections for the governor of the state of Lara, very important state in Venezuela. And he was defeated by a Chavista. And he said, you know, I lost these elections, and we have to recognize when we win and when we lose, thus criticizing much of the rest of the Venezuelan opposition. So he has changed, and undoubtedly that has something to do with the threats against him on the part of Washington. So I believe that this polarization that Trump is very largely responsible for has affected Venezuelan politics in a big way and affected Maduro's chances for solving the very pressing economic problems that exist in Venezuela. Because I personally believe that the Venezuelan economy is in a bad way. I mean, nobody really can deny that, and I don't think anybody does. Some people, you hear people in Venezuela at least who are anti-government say, you know, Maduro doesn't take seriously the economic situation. No, I think that they all do. They all do publicly, and if you talk to them, or you interview them, there's no question. Everybody knows what's going on. In order to solve these problems, the government has to take very difficult measures and probably pay a political price for taking them. I don't think that the measures that Maduro has to take can be placed somewhere on the ideological spectrum. I don't think it's a question of being right, center, or left. When you have hyperinflation, you know, you're going to have to take difficult measures. I'll just give you one example, which people in Venezuela feel very strongly about, and that is the price of gasoline. Here in the States, you know, gasoline in Venezuela, up until recently, was practically free. You know, very, very, very cheap. In fact, people, you go to the gas station, you'd see people paying with a with a bill of, you know, with hyperinflation, you forget whether it's 5 bolívares, 50 bolívares, or 500 bolívares. Let's say it costs 2 bolívares, and the person pays with a 5 bolívar bill. And the guy, the gas station attendant goes to give him the change, 3 bolívares change, and the driver says, hold on to it. So that's your tip. So 150% tip, because 5 bolívares is nothing in Venezuela. That's how cheap gasoline is. That's a difficult decision. Now, here in the United States, would say it's a no-brainer. You know, gasoline cannot be free. But in Venezuela, in the past, even way before Chavez, when gasoline prices were increased, there were protests. And the most famous protest that occurred in Venezuela was in 1989, resulting in between 2,000 and 4,000 deaths. The official statistic was 200 and something. And that was set off by an increase in the price of gasoline. So it's necessary to make difficult moves like that to increase the price of gasoline. Everybody is in favor of that. But in order to be able to do that, Maduro needs some kind of consensus. He needs people in the opposition to say, we go along with this because it's necessary for the economy. It's not a question of being on the right side of the political spectrum or the center or the left. There is really a consensus in favor of measures like that. In fact, I was just reading this morning a Chavista economist by the name of Rodrigo Cabezas, who's now very critical of Maduro, but he's an economist professor at the University of Zulia. He was an important political leader, but he's kind of distanced himself a little from Maduro. And he made that statement. These are difficult measures. He supports coming to terms with the IMF. I'm not in agreement with that. But he is right, I believe, in saying that whatever Maduro does, he's going to pay a price. And it's necessary to achieve a consensus. With the polarization that Trump is promoting in Venezuela, that is not likely. Venezuela needs somewhat of a consensus. Maduro makes a plea for dialogue. That's, his banner. He stated this all along. The opposition has been very opportunistic. They reject it. I'm talking about what happened back in 2014, if I remember correctly. They rejected it, then they accepted. They sat down with Maduro. There was a big roundtable type discussion. Maduro participated. Everybody saw it on TV. Everybody was it was upbeat. Everybody was quite pleased. Maduro was listening to what everybody was saying. And then about a week later, they dropped out of the dialogue. And this has happened several times. So that what is needed is a dialogue. What is needed is, a consensus. Not taking in the radicals of the opposition, but taking in the moderates. And that would have a snowball kind of effect. I think that would generate a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of support across the political spectrum. So Trump is having a nefarious effect on Venezuelan politics. And that's one of the side effects of the sanctions and the discourse that's coming out of Washington. There is another aspect that I wanted to discuss, and that is that not only are these sanctions having a direct effect economically, and that Venezuela is having a difficult time in refinancing its public debt, and not only do the sanctions prohibit the state oil company, the Venezuelan oil company here in the States, Citgo. Are there Citgo stations here in Minnesota? Well, Citgo, I think, is the largest dispenser of gasoline here in the States, and is 100% Venezuelan owned. It was bought by the Venezuelan government back in the 1980s. Trump has prohibited Citgo from transferring profits back to Venezuela. Joe Emmersberger, who is somebody very good on empirical analysis, he does a lot of very, very minute kind of calculations, etc. He's estimated that the Venezuelan government has been deprived of $1 billion since those sanctions went into effect over a year ago. So not only that, but there's something else going on that, again, nobody talks about. I mean, the direct effect, yeah, the Maduro government talks about. But I don't think they've done a really thorough job in explaining, at least here in the States, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they're quite limited in what they can do in the States, in a country where the entire mainstream media only publishes negative articles. I mean, there isn't one article on Venezuela in the last, I don't know how many years, that presents just a balanced notion of what's happening in Venezuela. It's all anti-Maduro, so it's not easy. But in any case, I think of all the people in the Trump administration, I mentioned Haley, the ex-ambassador to the United Nations, I mentioned Tillerson, the ex-Secretary of State, and by the way, it seems kind of ludicrous, but these people are being called moderates compared to Bolton and Pompeo. I guess they are. In the case of Haley, I don't know, but she's being called a moderate. And Tillerson, I never thought I'd see the day in which the ex-president of Exxon would be called a moderate. But I think the most damaging thing, the person that is inflicting the most amount of damage is Mnuchin, because he is carrying out a campaign. He's organized workshop-type meetings with representatives of Japan, Europe, Latin America, in order to discuss the sanctions against those Venezuelans who are involved in those Venezuelans tied to the Venezuelan government, involved in corruption, money laundering, and the drug trafficking. And Mnuchin and the other members of the Department of the Treasury talk about the need to discover where Maduro and Celia Flores, his wife, have their money. They say 70% of the social programs has been siphoned off. So we have to track down this money. We have to find out where this money is coming from. They talk about Hong Kong. They talk about Panama. Now, what kind of effect does this have? This intimidates U.S. financial institutions. And I don't want to give the impression that financial institutions are neutral bodies, and they're not, they're neutral. I mean, of course, they're opposed to Chavez, especially when Chavez called himself a socialist. So they're not neutral bodies. But even at that, there's a fear of having anything to do, not only with these, I don't know how many now, 70, 80 Venezuelans which are on this list, which Trump says these people will get their holdings, all their money deposited in a U.S. bank are going to be frozen. Well, that's absurd, because nobody in the Maduro government is going to be that foolish to deposit their money in a bank account in the United States. But not only that, you know, I don't know if people know who Carlos Andrés Pérez was. He was the ex-president, he was president twice in Venezuela. And he was practically impeached. If he had waited 2 or 3 days before he resigned, he would have been impeached. He would have been ousted as president in 1993. And one of the reasons why he was impeached was that he was accused of having money in U.S. banks. And he said, I don't have anything. I don't have $1. I don't have anything in U.S. banks. And the next day, the newspaper El Nacional published a facsimile of his bank account with his partner, who he later married. He was married at the time with another woman. His partner, who, after he left office, divorced his wife and married her. And so they had an account. They had accounts in the United States. So, you know, if any of these people accused of corruption have accounts in the United States, that money will be frozen, and that information will be made public. Obviously, there's something else behind this list of people who are being sanctioned. It's creating a fear among everybody in the world of finance, in the corporate world, of having anything to do with the Venezuelan economy. That's the bottom line. It means that basically there's a blockade, a financial blockade of the entire Venezuelan economy. That is the net effect of these sanctions and these, this narrative that's coming out of Washington and the actions of Mnuchin in particular. Now, I wanted to discuss the accusations against the Maduro government, not coming from the right. The discourse coming from the right is that Venezuela is not a democracy, it's a dictatorship. And I could go into that if anybody during the Q&A want information or want to know my opinion about that. I think that it is entirely misleading. Making a distinction between electoral fraud and certain things that the Venezuelan government is doing and can be criticized for. But that the Trump administration, but things which really are not, I would say, outrageous. I don't know if that's the best word. But the Venezuelan democracy is not perfect. And, you know, us people in the United States know that that's the case because we see here in the United States an election in which the President of the United States uses the term fraud, electoral fraud, in Arizona and in Florida. And the Democrats talk about the same thing and talk about voter suppression in Georgia. And we also know how undemocratic the electoral college system is, in which the Democrats win elections, not only the 2 elections that everybody knows about for president in 2000 and 2016, but usually win the popular vote, and yet the Republicans controlled up until a few days ago the 2 houses, the executive, and the Supreme Court. So we all know that. But electoral fraud is when you miscount the votes. And if you can demonstrate that you have electoral fraud on a massive basis, then you could say that Venezuela is not democratic. But that's not the case. And James Carter stated that the Venezuelan electoral system is the best system that his Carter Center has observed in the 90-odd electoral contests that the center has been observer for, because the Venezuelan electoral system is based on electronic voting as well as the ballot. That's the way it is throughout the whole country. It's a uniform system. It's not like the states, where every state is different, and in some cases, every municipality has different rules and regulations. In Venezuela, it's the same throughout the whole country. And I know the system because even though I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm not a Venezuelan citizen, I have the right to vote in local and state elections, not at the national level. And I know how it works. And I really cannot see how it could possibly be fraudulent. Because even if you say that somebody is hacking into the system, it's based on a digital result. The voter, after voting digitally, a ballot comes out, a paper ballot comes out, and you sign the ballot, thus certifying that vote, those candidates that you voted for, represent the candidates that you voted for. And once you do that, you put your paper ballot in a box, and that box gets opened and counted with observers of all the parties. All the parties have the right to observe that process. So there is an electoral fraud in Venezuela. And the best that the opposition can come up with is as ludicrous as Trump saying that over 3 million people voted in the last elections illegally, and therefore he really won the popular vote. It's as ludicrous as that, because all they can say is, you know, there was a student at the university, Thompson River University in the state of British Columbia. I was there before I came to the United States. I did the part of the tour in Canada. And a Venezuelan student said, he said, when I went to vote the last time, I saw in the book, you know, you go to vote and then you sign a book. And your fingerprint as well next to your signature. And he said, I saw that somebody who was dead, that I know had passed away, he had voted. So that there's electoral fraud, ipso facto. There is electoral fraud in Venezuela. And I wanted to say two things, but I only said once, because I try to hold myself down. What I did say was, even if that was the case, in those elections, in the elections of October of last year, the elections for governor, the Chavistas won in all but 5 states. And all those states, with one exception, the state of Bolivar, they won with a difference of 10 to 15 percentage points. In other words, they won by, you know, tens of thousands of votes. It's impossible that the opposition, that the Chavistas would have organized something systematically. I mean, that would have been so easy to document. The opposition has resources. The Chamber of Commerce is opposed to the government, so, and not to mention the CIA, NED, and USAID. They have all the money in the world. They could have easily documented, taking photographs, etc. That's what I said. What I didn't say, because I try to be discreet, is you're a liar. Because you can't go into the voting center and look at all the signatures. And what is the lower probability? You go to sign, and right next to your signature, there's somebody that you know, and you can look at the identification number. It's called cedula. Everybody has a cedula. Names are so common, you know, just like in the States with Smith and Brown, you have Perez, Gonzalez, Rodriguez. So you're going to tell me that you knew the number of the cedula of this person, and you were able to examine, or just out of chance, his or her signature was right above or right below yours? That's hard to believe. So in any case, there is no reason to believe that there is electoral fraud in Venezuela. So I'm not going to refute what the right says. But I'd like to, and I notice the time factor, it's okay. I wanted to just address what some people on the left, some progressive people, and progressive people across the spectrum on the left, not the so-called ultra-left, the so-called moderate left, but you find people in different positions on the political spectrum on the left, saying basically that Maduro has been a complete failure, that it would be good if he were to step down, and that, in effect, the Venezuelan government is no better than the opposition. It's what I call a plague on both your houses approach. There is an online publication, Jacobin, which I like reading a lot. I've published a couple of articles, two articles in Jacobin. They carry some good stuff, and they're pretty pluralistic. And on this issue, the issue of this plague on both your houses on Venezuela, they've published both. They've published at least 2 articles that support that position, and 2 articles, one by a guy by the name of George Cicariello Mayer, a professor, a university professor who just was forced to step down from his position in Philadelphia, in Dexter University, because of the pressure that they placed on him. He wrote an article, and there was another as well, that tried to refute the plague on both your houses position. The argument is that Chavez, and especially Maduro, didn't do enough, in fact, didn't do really anything to sever Venezuela's dependence on oil. And this position is a position that they apply to the Venezuelan case, but they apply it to all the so-called pink tide countries, all the progressive governments that came to power after Chavez in Bolivia. Morales is still president in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay. And basically they say that you've got as much dependence on these products that produce contamination, the mineral products that produce contamination and also make the country dependent on the global economy, so that when the price of that product declines, their economy is affected. So the idea is you have to diversify in order to avoid that kind of, in order to overcome that kind of dependence. That's the argument. And their argument is completely correct. There's no question about it. To talk specifically about Venezuela, Chavez did not succeed in overcoming dependence on oil. But I would say 2 things about that thesis. One is that the dependence on the oil, the failure to diversify the economy, is let's say an error. But it's got to be placed in context. Chavez realized that he had to gain the support of the popular sectors of the population, and not just the support, the active support. He realized that he would be overthrown. In fact, he was overthrown in April of 2002. And if it wasn't because of the fact that the poor people came down from the hills, because in Caracas the poor people live on the hills, although there are some hills that are for the upper middle class, but the shanty towns are up in the hills. And they came down from the hills, and Chavez returned to power as a result of that mass mobilization in which the people surrounded the presidential palace, but also the military barracks, because they got word of the fact that Chavez had his supporters within the military, unlike Allende, who didn't have the kind of active support. They were military people who were institutional-minded and opposed, a right-wing coup, but they weren't pro-socialist. They weren't pro-Allende. In Venezuela, Chavez came from the military. That had something to do with it. And also, the military in Venezuela has a whole different tradition, from that of Chile and Peru and other countries. The military, especially the Army and the National Guard, tends to be the preserve of the lower middle class, not the upper class. And so you had people in the military, officers in the military, who rose up against that against that coup against Chavez, and that facilitated everything that happened. The poor people surrounded the barracks, encouraged the military officers to rebel, and that led into the return to power of Hugo Chavez. That would not have happened had Chavez emphasized productivity, if Chavez had emphasized economic diversification. I mean, all these things are important, but you have to, especially in a third world country where resources are limited, you have to set priorities. And Chavez's priority was the social programs. So the context is important. The social programs took precedence. And that was the case because it was necessary. Firstly, because it was necessary from a political viewpoint, but also because Chavez had emphasized from the very outset, before he was elected president in 1998, that there was a social debt. That was the term that he used. Deuda social. The social debt was with the poor people. It was something similar to reparations here in the United States for African Americans. He said that the government, the society, has a social debt with regard to the very poor. And so when Chavez was elected president, he stated something that the middle class hated. He said, I'm the president of all Venezuelans, and my job is to work in favor. Oh, that's the sound that I was wondering about that. I was wondering about that.
It's not authentic commentary.
Okay. I thought somebody was objecting to what I was saying. That I am the president. Chavez said, I'm the president, and I have to, and I will work in order to benefit the middle class, the upper middle class, the business sector, but my priority is with the poor. Not so much the working class, the organized working class that has unions, that belong to unions, that have leadership, but the very poor, the marginalized sectors of the population, the people who work in the informal economy that in Venezuela and throughout Latin America represent more or less 50% of the population. So that was his discourse. And he went beyond the discourse. He established social programs. That meant that the social programs and the lot of the very poor took priority over economic diversification. And so that's part of the context. Another part of the context was after the coup that failed against Chavez, and after the general strike, which really wasn't a general strike. The term general strike is a misnomer. In Venezuela, that's the term that they use, el paro general. Actually, to tell you the truth, the word paro in Spanish has different connotations. Because really, it was a lockout. Because the private sector spearheaded that general strike. So the workers, even though the head of the Workers' Federation, who was a member of the pro-establishment AD party, the Party of Democratic Action, which was by then a centrist party, he called on the workers not to go to work. But that was irrelevant because the gates were closed. The workers couldn't work. And so after that, Chavez stated, we will not provide those coup business people, the business people who supported the overthrow of my government, the Chamber of Commerce, whose president became president of Venezuela for those 2 days during the coup, Pedro Carmona. So it was a coup that was spearheaded by the Chamber of Commerce. And the general strike was also spearheaded by the Chamber of Commerce. He said, no preferential dollars to the coup people. In Spanish, ni un golpe, ni un dólar a los golpistas. Not $1 to the business people who supported the coup. So they would have to go to the black market and purchase dollars at a higher price. Because the preferential dollars were dollars that the government sold at a lower price. So who got these preferential dollars? The business people who didn't support the coup, who didn't support the general strike. Now, who were these business people? It was an emerging bourgeoisie some of those people were politically neutral. Some of them might have had sympathy for the Chavista project. But a lot of them said that politics is not our business, that a general strike goes against, or lockout goes for political reasons, in order to overthrow a government, goes against the professional ethics of business people. We're not out here to decide on things politically. Our job is to produce. So regardless of the motives, and some of the business people were opportunists. They didn't support the strike because they figured it was going to fail. It did fail. And they benefited as a result. But regardless of the motive, Chavez realized that those people were more reliable than the business people who supported the general strike and who supported the coup in April of 2002. Now, that was politically correct in my opinion, because Chavez only had two options. Either close your eyes and forget about what happened the year before, which would have been dumb, and Chavez was anything that you like other than dumb. He was very astute, and he realized that the coup leaders, the business people, would have given him 6 months of peace if they got these preferential dollars, and then 6 months later they would have tried to overthrow him again. So that made sense from a political viewpoint, but it was conducive to corruption. And the problem of corruption, which is a problem in Venezuela, nobody can deny it. Maybe some, diehard Chavistas, will deny it. I don't know. But corruption is a problem in Venezuela. It always has been. There's no question about that. Way before Chavez. But that has to be understood in the context of an ongoing war against the Chavez government, an attempt to destabilize the Chavez and Maduro government. So that basically what I'm saying is that the position that states that the government is as bad as the opposition, and I'm opposed to both on equal terms, ignores the fact that mistakes that have been made and problems that confront Venezuela have to be understood in context. And the second point that I want to make is that these writers, and I've read enough of the academics who write in this vein, who are somewhat progressive, you know where they're coming from, and they're more or less on the left side of the political spectrum, but they have the thesis known as neo-extractivism, which is that these governments are dependent on extractivism. That produces contamination, and it produces or accentuates dependency. They don't talk about the positive aspects of these pink tide governments, and specifically in the case of Venezuela. I'll give you a few examples. One is the social programs. People like James Petrus, and some of you might have heard of James Petrus, an important scholar and a person of great integrity who has been writing on political issues going back to the 60s, and I admire and respect his work very much. But he's in this camp. He has just published, a couple of years ago, he published a book with Henry Veldmeyer that states just that. What they say, and others, is that the social programs were good because they provided goods and services to the poor people. But they leave it at that. And some of those writers, like Spampa, an Argentine academic who teaches in Great Britain, states that those programs have a negative effect because they justify the extractivism, so that the discourse of these governments is the exploitation of the mining, the dependence on mining, dependence on oil, is necessary in order to finance the social programs. So her argument is, and Eduardo Godínez and others say that the social programs are really having a negative effect because they're justifying dependence, and they're justifying ecological damage that is being brought about as a result of the exploitation of the minerals. And not only the minerals, but also, in the case of Argentina and Brazil, soybeans, etc. The problem is that what these writers don't talk about is that the positive aspect of the social programs is not only that the poor people are getting goods and services that they didn't get in the past, but that these programs are promoting popular participation in decision making. They're incorporating sectors of the population that were completely marginalized. As I said before, these people belong to the informal economy. They don't have any previous experience with participation, with activism, with decision making. In Venezuela, the community councils, which were created in 2006 as a result of the law of community councils that was passed in April of 2000, I believe April of 2006, that resulted in a proliferation of community councils. You know, there's a paradigm of bottom-up democracy, the social movements, that's what change is all about, and there's certain social movements are certainly important. But at least in Venezuela, there's a bottom-up kind of phenomenon in which the people have really made history. There's no question about that. But there's also a top-down. The initiative for some of these changes comes from the central government. This proliferation of community councils came about because members of the Minister of Popular Participation went out into the barrios and said, this law was just passed, and your communities are qualified for money for public works projects. But the law states that this money is funneled through community councils or communal councils. And so these people, they're called promoters. They really set off a process of the creation of communal councils in barrios throughout, in rural areas throughout the country. And these communal councils meet in assemblies. They decide on priority public works projects. They solicit funding from the municipal, state, and federal government. They get the funding. Sometimes the funding goes to construction companies, but the communal councils oversee the work of the companies. They insist that people in their communities be hired as electricians, as plumbers, as brick layers. So there's an active participation of people who previously were completely ignored by the politicians and by the elected officials. So that's, you know, one point that these people on the left who condemn the pink-tie governments and condemn the Maduro government ignore in their writings. Also, you know, participatory democracy. That was incorporated in the constitutions of Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela. Now, participatory democracy, you know, is a slogan. It sounds good. In Venezuela, it's a novel slogan, but I go back far enough to know that that was an SDS, Students for Democratic Society slogan, back in the 60s. But it's new for Venezuela. And it's not just a slogan that's incorporated in the Constitution. For instance, well, these communal councils that I just mentioned, that is an example of participatory democracy. You don't have any president. You don't have any chairman or chairperson of the communal councils. There are spokespeople. They're called voceros. So there's no hierarchy. There's no central leadership of those councils. And the decisions are made in the assemblies. In addition to that, the Constitution talks of referendums and recall elections. And that's not just a constitutional item. In Venezuela, you've had referendums on several occasions. You've had recall in 2007, which incidentally Chavez lost. It was a, no, I'm sorry, that was the referendum in 2007. referendum to modify the Constitution. And it was voted down by the people, not by much, by 1 or 2 percentage points. But Chavez recognized that his initiative was defeated. In Bolivia and Ecuador also, they've held referendums. Imagine here in the United States, if we had that for the national level. Some states have referendums and recall elections. California, my state of Connecticut just voted by ballot, and there were 2 questions on the ballot. But at the national level, I mean, we could have a recall of President Trump. Or we could have a referendum on military spending, or single-payer health, or what have you. So that that is a second breakthrough of the pink tide governments, specifically the government of Chavez. And Maduro has maintained the policies of Chavez, so that this is a dimension of the Chavez government that these critics on the left pretty much ignore. Thirdly, economic policy. There's a lot with regard to Maduro's economic policy that I personally would criticize, and I do criticize. You can Google my name, some of my stuff is on the web, and you can see, or during the Q&A, we can talk about that. But the fact of the matter is, there are downsides, but there are also pluses. And again, the opposition, or the people on the left who criticize Maduro and say that he should go, they ignore that. But the nationalization of strategic sectors of the economy is an example of a plus. This has been a banner of political parties going back to the 40s in Venezuela. Chavez comes in and he nationalized electricity, he nationalized telecommunications from Verizon, he nationalized the oldest bank in Venezuela, which had been bought out by the Spanish bank, Santander. The whole Venezuelan economy had been privatized, had been turned over to multinational corporations in the 1990s. All these companies that I mentioned had been Venezuelan, either state or private, but Venezuelan. And they were passed over, they were bought out by international capital. Well, Chavez renationalized those companies. And it seems to me that the people on the left who criticize Maduro and criticize Chavez for having nationalized and created companies that are poorly managed, some of them are, there's no question about it. Unfortunately, that's true. But that doesn't detract from the importance of those nationalizations. Because, look at, in Mexico in 1938, one of the most important events in the history of Latin America in the 20th century was the nationalization of the oil industry. Everybody knows that Pemex is poorly managed. It has been for a long time. But that doesn't detract from the importance of the nationalization of oil. It's a symbol. It's a point of reference for Latin America. And lastly, just if I could just sum up here, the foreign policy of the Chavez and Maduro governments. I mean, you can pardon people on the right who don't like the foreign policy of the Maduro government. But people on the left, progressives, who say that Maduro hasn't gotten anything right, ignore the fact that both Maduro and Chavez have implemented a progressive foreign policy based on Latin American unity. Chavez was instrumental, played a lead role in the creation of organizations that have promoted unity and integration in Latin America, such as UNASUR, which played a key role in resolving local conflicts in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Venezuela. CELAC, which takes in all of Latin America. ALBA, which takes in the more leftist governments of Latin America. So those are breakthroughs that can't be ignored. I'll just end by saying I don't think that solidarity work can be effective with that message. Anybody who says, I'm opposed to the sanctions, and I'm certainly opposed to military intervention in Venezuela, but I think that Maduro has to go, or I think that Maduro is as bad as the opposition, is not, no matter how sincere they are not going to be effective in winning people over, and they'll probably cease to work on this issue, because there are so many other issues, they will probably go over to another cause. So it seems to me that it's important. The devil is in the detail, and it's important to understand these breakthroughs in order to understand how damaging the sanctions and the threats of military intervention and military coups have been for Venezuela. Thank you.
Humans and dogs alike. We're gonna get set up for Q&A, but what I wanted to do is on your seats, we have some postcards. One of the benefits of having this event today is that now that we're done with the elections, maybe people in this state could talk about something else other than elections. But also, we've recently elected some people, so we should make them do some stuff, right? Like, I'm tired of having people come and tell me what they want me to do. I want them to do something, okay? So, I wrote little messages to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Smith, and there are plenty of pens that we've got, but we'd love to send some postcards for you. I also encourage people to write their addresses on the postcard in addition to your name, because it's important for them to realize that you're a real constituent, you're a real person, so they don't just think that like we went to Iowa and got like random people to sign these postcards. So it's important to look like you're a real person. And since everybody in the state of Minnesota is the same senators, it doesn't matter which city you live in. So we encourage you to send a message. We wrote one for you, but also feel free to augment it and write your own. I wrote my own in addition to that message. Also, Ria's got a beautiful basket, and we would love to take your money. It takes a lot of money to be able to fight U.S. imperialism. And the fact of the matter is that the situation is very scary right now in Venezuela. I think it's important for people to know that if, for example, Trump does organize for a coup d'etat, that the anti-war committee will be there at the federal building leading protests saying that we want an end to this policy. The anti-war committee, this is not our first event we've done about Venezuela. And we think it's really important to have this be a center of activism. And so if you have the ability to help contribute towards this event and other events, it would be great if you could put money in our cute little basket. And I also want to recognize that we had co-sponsors for tonight's events who also did contribute money as well as enthusiasm for tonight's event. So we wanted to thank the Minnesota Peace Action Coalition, the Minnesota Cuba Committee, the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, and Women Against Military Madness. So thank you also for your support. Also on your chairs, you got a flyer. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the Anti-War Committee is turning 20 years old, and we're almost legal to drink, but we are legal to vote. We want to invite you to our anniversary party, and so it's going to be on December 8th, so please feel free to take this with you. And you could feel free to take other copies of the flyer too if you wanted, and you could hang them up. Okay? As we said at the beginning, we're going to have questions, and we would like to prioritize having questions. If we have extra time, we can have a discussion, but the idea is that Steve is not going to be with us after tomorrow. He's flying away. Whereas the rest of us will still be here. And so we will have the ability to continue this conversation, but we really wanted to prioritize giving people an opportunity to ask questions so they could get the information that they wanted about Venezuela. Jenny and I are going to keep stack, and our hope is to try to hear from as many different people as possible. We'd really appreciate it if people were respectful of the Anti-War Committee's wishes that we would like people to ask questions as opposed to say manifestos. And so that would be really nice. Although I have lots of manifestos inside of me, and I would be happy to talk to you about them after the event. Okay? So, are there questions that we have for Steve? Okay? The young lady with the Carlton sweatshirt.
So here, especially in this area, we I think, do a pretty good job of working in solidarity with each other in different groups. And particularly, our anti-war groups try to reach out to environmental groups and whatnot. Is that a privilege of our area, or is there the ability to do environmental work and recognize the social work? And you were talking about sometimes that's a conflict. Or is that being talked about within the social, the government movement.
It's a good question, and I think that it's somewhat of a knotty issue. I wouldn't discard the statements that some of these writers make about environmental damage. In the case of Ecuador, in the case of Bolivia, I would say that at the same time that all three governments are very conscious of the problem of global climate change, that it's part of the discourse, and that a big bulk of the movement in all three cases are very conscious of the problem and favor measures in order to confront the problem. But I wouldn't say that these governments have set a positive example in terms of things that are actually going on. So I think that that you have to be open and honest about that. And I think that just like everything else I mentioned before, with regards to Venezuelan democracy, there are things that, I forget the term that I used, outrageous. I don't think that they're outrageous, but there are certain things that I would criticize. And they have to be recognized. But that doesn't mean that you accept what the opposition says, that Venezuela is a dictatorship. Well, the same thing in terms of environmental, the negative effect of projects in all three cases, in the case of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela.
Carol, you had your hand up? Did you have your hand up, Carol?
Me?
Carol. Carol, okay, then, yes, I had you. I wrote woman with gray sweatshirt. Yes.
No.
Go, you sure? Okay, all right, great.
Okay, my question is, what do you think the Venezuelan government will do, its military, if it's invaded by the U.S. Along with the Brazilians and the Colombians, because they wouldn't go in by themselves, I don't believe. How do you think the military, the Venezuelan military would react, and how would the people react to that?
Well, okay, I'll take that separately. How would the Venezuelan military react and how would the people react? The military, I really don't have any empirical information. My wife's family is, several people in her family is military, so I know them, but I really can't generalize. But I can say that it's got to be recognized that, as I said before, that Maduro, Chavez and now Maduro, have backing from officers who support the government not only because they have an institutional commitment to democracy, but because they believe in the project. Anti-imperialism is a term that the military uses, unlike before. And the opposition says, look, the military has been politicized. It's always been politicized. There's no question about it. Before Chavez, everybody knew that you had to be a member of AD or COPE, the two main parties. You couldn't even be a member of MAS, which was a third party, much smaller and socialist of sorts. Either AD or COPE. So the people who complain about that ignore that this is Venezuelan history. But the fact of the matter is that the Minister of Defense, is a firm believer in what the Chavista movement stands for, and that would lead one to believe that there would be resistance. And not only that, but Chavez, who was a strategist, in part because of his military background, he stated, if we get invaded, the military may be defeated. And so he created a militia. The militia always existed, but the militia was ex-officers. They were former officers. They were called the reserve. But Chavez, there were civilians who were armed in an organized way. And so an invasion is going to face, in my opinion, firm resistance. Secondly, with regard to people's reactions, I can say, look at, Chavez won all the elections, with the exception of one. When Maduro ran for president, he won by only between 1 and 2 percentage points. Obviously, a lot of people were Chavistas and are not pro-Maduro. But they're not going over to the opposition. The reason why the opposition won, the second elections that the opposition has won was in December of 2015. And they won not because they got a significant increase in the vote. It was very, very slim. They won because the Chavez people didn't vote, because they're discontent. I have observed, and this is a personal observation, but I have observed that a large number of these people who would call themselves Chavistas, but they're not with Maduro because of the economic situation, which is very difficult for people. And they blame it on Maduro. They say, I'm not living like I did before. It must be because of the government. They unfortunately don't have the context that I was referring to before in order to understand why this situation is so difficult, much more complex. But I have observed that they, with the news about Trump, the possibility of a U.S. invasion, every time that something is published about the threats, these people, are basically progressive. Some of them are leftists going way back in time. And so I believe that a military invasion would unify part of the country. Not all of it, because the opposition, the opposition is promoting the sanctions, is calling, in a coded fashion. They call for an invasion. When Trump said 2018 is the year of the Americas, the radical right, this group that I'm calling the fringe right, which is big, they felt empowered because what they were saying up until then was the United States doesn't take Latin America seriously. That was their big gripe. And that's a lie. The United States takes Latin America seriously. What they were basically saying was, why doesn't the United States invade Venezuela? When Trump said 2018 is going to be the year of America, of the Americas, the opposition felt empowered. They felt emboldened because that meant that Trump was going to send in troops. And that's what they want, I believe. But I think that there's a big chunk of the population, 50% easily, that is neither pro-Chavez nor pro-opposition. And any kind of military action, I think, would affect the opinion of those people. They would, move over to the pro-Chavez or pro-Maduro camp.
Okay. We'll take the lady with the green sweater. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, could you tell us some of your constructive criticism of the Maduro government?
Yes, sir. I have. Okay, I'll mention two. And one of them is, I've always said kind of jokingly, not kind of joking. If Maduro called me up on the phone and said, look, I know that you write about Venezuela and I want to hear what you have to say, but I've got limited time. I can only give you 5 minutes. Will you fly into Caracas and, I'll set you up a time and everything, I'll pay for your airfare. But you've only got 5 minutes. What I would tell him is that I think that a major mistake, which really goes back to Chavez, is that the government needs a gadfly. The idea of checks and balances, in my opinion, is not inherent in what's called liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is our model. It goes back to the 18th century, based on checks and balances, institutional checks and balances. That was the thinking of Madison, Montesquieu, Locke. Venezuelan democracy is based on another concept. It's based on, I think it's influenced by Marxism, which talks about totality. The idea is you don't have an artificial separation of powers. The system is one. That's basically what Marx said. It's a totality. You can't divide the Congress and the president. And you can't, and this comes from Gramsci and others, you can't divide the public and the private. The state is much more, Gramsci called it the integral state. So I think as a result of that, there hasn't been this idea that you have to have some semi-autonomous body that serves as a check on those in power. And I believe that that semi-autonomous body has to be the party. The party has to be distant from the state. It can't be one and the same. You can't have the state controlling the party, and that's what you have. When Chavez created the party that's now in power, the governing party, the Chavez party, it's called the PSUV, the Socialist United Party of Venezuela. He created that in early 2007. And he was the president of the party, which is okay. But the vice presidents, there were about 10 of them, and they were all people who were in the state, ministers, Congress people, at the state level, the governors, the mayors who were Chavistas. That, I believe, is a big mistake. The party has to be semi-autonomous, to serve, to criticize, to denounce corruption, which is a problem. So that would be what I tell him in 5 minutes. The other criticism, I have another criticism of Maduro, which I think is worth, discussing. And that is, Maduro, I think, has a dogmatic mindset when it comes to the market. The market is part of the capitalist system. There are Marxist economists who deny that, who state that there's nothing inherently capitalistic about the marketplace. That's a discussion, that's a debate. But the fact of the matter is that Venezuela is not socialist. It's capitalist. 80% of the Venezuelan economy is private. And the opposition, by the way, when it says, the rightists, when they say, what's happening in Venezuela demonstrates that socialism doesn't work. It's just the opposite. It's demonstrating that capitalism doesn't work. Yeah. So Maduro hasn't taken into account the marketplace. And so you have these wide disparities in terms of the price of goods, the regulated price of goods, and the price of those goods on the black market. The regulated price of the dollar as opposed to the black market. So that importers, if they don't get the preferential dollars, they have to go to the black market and pay much more for those dollars in order to pay for their imports. So I think that really is a problem that has to be tackled. So that would be my second criticism.
See Wyatt in the back.
I think some of the sort of pox on both houses discourse we hear nowadays, I think sometimes it gets targeted directly at Maduro. I think there's a lot of people who will say Chavez was great, but Maduro is sort of not as great. Yeah. So I wonder, in the spirit of combating some of the narratives that are putting all this pressure on Venezuela, if you could say, what are the successes of Maduro in particular?
Well, I tried to talk about that, and I just summarize. The first was the social programs that promoted incorporation, and that Maduro has continued. I think, with regard to this distinction between Maduro and Chavez, Maduro has not deepened the process of change. He has, I think his merit is that he has retained the progressive aspects of, and the breakthroughs and the successes of the Chavez government. He hasn't turned to neoliberalism for the most part, although there is some, concern that some of the deals in the oil industry represent a kind of privatization. Elias Howard, who's one of the leading Chavistas, has expressed a concern about that. But for the most part, Maduro has not caved in to the IMF. I mentioned before that one of the leading members of the Chavista movement, not one of the leading ones, but he was pretty important, Cabezas, Rodrigo Cabezas, he proposes that. Maduro hasn't done that. He hasn't negotiated with the IMF. He hasn't negotiated with the World Bank, which this guy Cabezas also proposed. Second, I mentioned the economic nationalizations, which Maduro hasn't privatized. So that, I think, is a second aspect. The third aspect was participatory democracy. and the fourth was the foreign policy. And Maduro has been as nationalistic in his foreign policy as Chavez was. So I think those four arguments can be used against the plague on both your houses approach.
Adam?
Hi. Earlier during your talk, you had mentioned that when Chavez was ousted, that large masses of the poor masses mobilized in order to counteract this action. You also had mentioned that the opposition that was antagonistic towards Chavez was made up of like Chamber of Commerce, like large business leaders. Does this delineation between like the bases that support these two different sides, is that still the case today? Do we still have masses of like poor, disenfranchised, marginalized people supporting the Maduro government and like more business interests supporting the opposition?
Yeah, well that's a good question. The polarization was very well defined from almost from the very outset. Chavez passed nationalistic legislation, and specifically an oil law. It's called La Ley Orgánica de Hidrocarburos in October of 2001, and an agrarian reform simultaneously. And that's precisely when the opposition started calling for the ouster of Chavez. I mean, there was a cause and effect relationship that was so obvious. And the Chamber of Commerce played a leading role. They called that the first general strike. It was on December 10th, 2001. And then the general strike that led into the coup. So the polarization, and then the poor people came down from the hills. Now, your question is, has that situation continued? And I'd say that it's modified somewhat. I'm used to that now. It's not. It scared me the first time. But the Chamber of Commerce around 2005, there were elections for president, and there were three candidates. One was a guy named Cudemos, who was identified with Chavez. He didn't win, but the three candidates said basically. The war on Chavez is not getting us anywhere. And so they call for some kind of reconciliation. So their discourse has changed. But they're opposed to the government. And as the opposition gets more aggressive, they too have taken a very, very critical approach, not calling for the ouster of Maduro, and perhaps being a little bit more open to dialogue with the government than the opposition. But there's no question that they are opposed to the government. With regard to the poor people, it's very significant that in 2014 and 2017, there were protests that in Spanish, in Venezuela, not Spanish in general, were called guarimba. 4 months, day after day, of so-called civil disobedience, but that's what the New York Times called it. And compared the leader who promoted that to Martin Luther King. But they built barricades on the streets, fire, boulders, and they attacked the security forces at nighttime. There were a lot of deaths. Many of them were their people, there's no question about it. But there were also a lot of innocent people who were killed. The Chavez government has one set of statistics, they have another. Who knows? I mean, I can't give you what the statistics are. But they killed 6 National Guardsmen and 1 or 2 policemen in 2014. In 2017, they went up to an Air Force base in Caracas, and they fired into the base. So they weren't playing with kid gloves. Their strategy, I'm convinced, in both cases, was they thought that their protests would penetrate the barrios. They weren't successful. But I believe that that's because the protests took place in the middle class areas. In 2014, they took place almost exclusively in those municipalities in which the mayor belonged to the opposition. You know, middle class, upper middle class, with an opposition mayor. You know, obviously the mayors were providing some support to those protests. In 2017, they penetrated municipalities such as where I live, in which the mayor was a Chavista, but the middle class areas, they did not penetrate the barrios, with very few exceptions. So that is an indication that the people in the barrios are not with the opposition. There's a lot of discontent. The people in the barrios have a long tradition of militant protests on the streets, but they did not go along with these middle-class protests. So that gives you some idea of the polarization that still exists. I'm not by that saying that the Chavistas have, you know, solid support in the barrios. They don't. The barrios are divided. But what I can say is that I don't think that there are many avid supporters of the opposition in the barrios. A lot of them are apathetic, skeptical, but they're not with the opposition, for the most part.
I'm going to take Gary and then Kathleen, but Gary first.
Steve, we get a lot of general media reports about the collapse of the medical system. Could you talk a little bit about that from your experience, and especially that part of the medical delivery system that 40,000 Cubans are involved with, which is, you know, the delivery of the primary care in the poorest areas. What has been the impact of the economic situation on the ability of the government to continue that key aspect of its social program?
Right. Well, that program has continued under Maduro. These are, it's called the Misión Barrio Dentro. And Cuban doctors going where Venezuelan doctors were not willing to set up shop, namely in the barrios. You didn't have any doctors with offices in the barrios. And this is where, for the most part, the Cuban doctors are located. And, you know, it's, I've gone there for different things. Well, at least on 2 occasions. And, you know, you see long lines of people, you know, people getting service from the Cuban doctors. With regard to the collapse of the system, well, that's part of the system, but that's primary care. I heard a doctor, actually a dentist, who belongs to the opposition, say, you know, belittling the importance of that, saying, oh, that's primary care. That's like putting a Band-Aid on. It's not like putting a Band-Aid on. The whole idea of primary care is that you avoid a situation where people go to the hospitals because they get the problem solved, and so it doesn't intensify, it doesn't deteriorate to such an extent that the person has to be operated on in a hospital. The hospitals, the service in the hospitals has deteriorated. There's no question about it. But keep in mind that those doctors, and even some of the people who run the hospitals, are members of the opposition. You know, I can talk on the basis of a lot of experience with regard to the universities, because I'm a university professor, and the universities are run by the opposition, all of them. And there's a deterioration of the universities. But who runs the university? My university is run by the same party that I mentioned before, Democratic Action, AD. So when people talk about the deterioration of the universities, the government has, you know, part of the blame. But the government can't really do anything because there's a long tradition. The government, there's a long tradition in Latin America, in Venezuela, of university autonomy. The government just can't go in there and fire professors. Impossible. They can't do it. And with regard to the hospitals, there's something similar to that. So it seems to me that there's a shared responsibility in terms of that deterioration. But you have to really talk about a dual system. The Misión Sucre, I think, has been very beneficial for the poor people. But on the other hand, there's no question about it, the hospitals and the shortage of medicine is a reality. That has a lot to do with the sanctions, in which the government cannot import certain items. You know, there was one case of $1.6 billion of the Venezuelan government's money in Belgium, in a clearinghouse. They decided to freeze that money. That money was to pay for food and medicine. So all these factors have to be taken into account.
Kathleen?
Would Venezuela be better off if Hugo Chavez had nationalized more industry?
I think that, I don't think so. I think that what was important about Chavez is that the strategic industries were nationalized. And that, as I said before, is a long-standing banner in Venezuela. I mean, he did what most Venezuelan politicians were calling for, with a few exceptions. I think that he wasn't confiscating these companies, and it would have been costly to have continued to nationalize, because it would have meant a drain on the budget. And of course, the price of oil was up above $100 a barrel at the time. But had he nationalized more, the Venezuelan debt would have been worse. And so I don't think that would have been the way to go.
We've got a stack here, and so what I want to do is we've got William, and then Mary, Misty, and then Sarah. And then I think we're going to be after 7, which is fine. I know the owner of the building. I think we'll be okay. But I want to respect the fact that we did reserve the space till 7. So we're going to cede 7. But then also, if we've got a couple more people who want to ask questions after that, maybe they could talk to Steve while we also clean up the space. Okay? All right. So William, you're next.
Yeah. So we work with immigrants here now. And I am a member of a union in the construction here in the US and in Minnesota. So I don't know how you contact with the poor Venezuelan, no? But for how you speak and everything sounds you are a middle class too, the same of the other people there, no? And like right now in a job I am, no, all the group is coming from Venezuela. So it sound, now this is how the people explain me. It sound this big company from Virginia gone to Venezuela and bring these people with visa and working here for $12 per hour with no benefits, with no nothing, like 7 in the morning to 9 p.m. here. No, and these people don't have no benefits, no nothing. No, and when these people explain me about how these companies oppress nice job in the U.S., I asking these people, very, very, you can see it's poor people in Venezuela. No, it's no middle class, it's no high class, it's like the poor people, And now these people, told me how feel be a Venezuelan here and feel like a real immigrant. Now, but for everybody, it's like all the people like from El Salvador, from Mexico, or you are the immigrant. But now when you hear people from Venezuela, everybody's like, what? No, it's a big change of face. So I don't know how you feel, and or I don't know, you have a contact with people there, and how the people feel there and came to this, or you hear something about people moving from Venezuela to working here for cheap labor, actually be a cheap labor like us, the immigrants.
Yeah, there's a large immigrant flow from Venezuela, and you're right, it represents a change for Venezuela, because historically Venezuelans didn't emigrate. They traveled as tourists, but you saw very few Venezuelans here in the United States. That at least was my experience in the Spanish-speaking community. But keep in mind that the problem of immigration is being exploited politically by the Trump administration and others, because the narrative is this is a threat, that the immigration is a threat to security. Pence stated that recently, that Venezuelan immigration in Colombia is a threat to Colombia, and Colombia is our ally. That's what Pence said. So they're politicizing the situation, and they're exaggerating. There's no question about it. There's a very large Venezuelan immigration, population abroad. But look at, in the case of Colombia, there are 5 million Colombians in Venezuela. Because of the poverty in Venezuela, because of the political violence in Venezuela, I'm sorry, in Colombia. The violence in Colombia, the poverty in Colombia, 5 million, you know, when I first arrived in Venezuela in the 1970s, when I saw that, according to the United Nations, there are 2.6 million Venezuelans who have immigrated all over, not just Colombia. So with the Colombian immigration to Venezuela, nobody was talking about a threat to national security. The United States wasn't intervening and talking about the fact that something had to be done about the problem. You know, this problem of immigration should not be politicized, but it's being politicized. And it's an excuse, both in the case of Colombia, in the case of Brazil, to send troops to the border. Maduro had just announced, I just read it today, that he announced that he was going to send more troops to the Colombian border because some paramilitary people, apparently in the members of the ELN, but it's not really clear, they were apprehended by the Venezuelan government. And this paramilitary group took reprisals. They ambushed and killed 3 Venezuelan soldiers. That is creating a very delicate situation on the border. And, you know, the president of Colombia, Duque, issued a statement saying that he was sorry what happened. That's great. But the fact of the matter is that Colombian troops on the border are just intensifying the tension. When Pence makes the statement that this is a threat to national security, you know, this is an explosive situation. And I believe there's a strategy behind it. The strategy is to drain resources, to force the Venezuelan government. You know, I just said that Maduro is sending troops to the border. That's a drain on resources. And I think that's part of the strategy.
Mary, you were next.
I was wondering if there's international support for the Maduro government in Venezuela, like something like BRICS was at one time.
China.
China is included in that, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, there is. China has said recently, for instance, that it supports Venezuela. It stated that China voted for Venezuela's membership as a temporary member of the Security Council of the United Nations, which it became. Both Russia has issued statements of solidarity with Venezuela and indirectly criticizing the Trump administration for its threats against Venezuela. Venezuela has an interesting alliance with Turkey, even though Turkey is hardly a model in terms of democracy. But it has good relations, and Turkey has even stated that it will accept the petro, which is the cryptocurrency of the Venezuelan state. And neither China nor Russia have accepted the crypto, although China has stated, an important member of the banking system of China has said some good things about the crypto. Turkey has stated that it will accept the crypto in international transactions. So it does have international support. Unfortunately, the position of the European Union has been very supportive of Trump. I mean, the same position of Trump, the European Union with regard to sanctions, not with regard to military intervention, but with regard to sanctions. And the same thing with China.
Thank you. All right, was it Misty's next and then Sarah? Okay, Sarah?
Do you see a relationship or a connection between what's going on in Nicaragua and the efforts to destabilize Nicaragua and Venezuela? What are the comparisons, kind of?
Well, I think it's the same playbook because in both cases, they use the protests and the confrontations and the deaths that have come out of those protests in order to isolate, in order to threaten action against those countries. And with regard to Venezuela in particular, those protests were designed to bring about regime change. There wasn't any other slogan, with the exception of "Free the political prisoners." That was the only other slogan. The slogan was, in 2014, "Salida ya," regime change now. And they dropped it now. But that was the only slogan. So that there was an intention, I believe, to promote violence and deaths in order to create an atmosphere in favor of regime change, intervention and regime change. And I'll just give you one example in the case of Venezuela, and that can certainly be applied to Nicaragua. The presidential candidate for the opposition on 2 occasions, against Chavez and then Maduro, Enrique Capriles, he stated in these more recent protests in 2017, day after day, he said, we're going to march downtown. We're going to reach downtown Caracas. All those marches began in the eastern part of Caracas, for the most part, which is where the upper middle class lives. And Capriles said, we have a right to reach downtown Caracas. We're going to go to the Attorney General's office, or we're going to go to the Parliament. They're all located in downtown Caracas. So that sounded good. But he knew full well that the government would not permit that. And why wouldn't the government permit that? Because in 2002, that's exactly how the coup began. They had a march in the eastern part of Caracas, a humongous march, and then all of a sudden, the leaders said, we're going to downtown Caracas. And that resulted in a confrontation, shooting, some deaths, and that was a justification for the overthrow. The whole thing was a setup. And I could go into detail about that. But the point is that it was obvious that the same thing would happen. In fact, one of the radical leaders, who I'm calling the radical right, Guevara is his name, he said, he used the term occupy. We're going to occupy, just like the Occupy movement here in the States. We're going to occupy, and we're not going to leave until, we get what we want. Obviously, if they had reached downtown Caracas, even though maybe there were only 10,000 protesters, they would have stayed, they would have sat down. The media, the international media would have come in. Anything that the police did to contain this rowdy group would have been transmitted in a favorable light with regard to the opposition. I saw CNN's coverage of the 2014 protests. I mean, it was incredible how they distorted what happened in favor of the opposition. So the game plan, the blueprint, was we get downtown, we sit down, we stay there, and then we call in our people from all over the country. Within 24 hours, you have 200,000, 500,000, people there, and Maduro would have no other alternative but to resign. So Capriles, day after day, said, we're marching to downtown Caracas. If this is a democracy, we have a right to do that. Day after day, there was a confrontation. They knew that the military, the security people wouldn't allow that. There were confrontations, people were killed, and yet Capriles said that on a day-by-day basis. Obviously, that is the game plan, that's the strategy. And I believe the same thing happened in the case of, is happening in the case of Nicaragua.
Let's give a round of applause and thanks to Steve. Thank you very much for coming. Feel free to take the invitations to the Anti-War Committee's anniversary party. You are invited. And feel free to sign your postcards and or to take extra postcards to share with other people. Thank you.